Some might say that in 1662 Thomas Watson's life fell apart. It was the year in which the Act of Uniformity was imposed, the year in which Watson, together with about 2,000 other godly preachers and teachers, was thrust out of his living and his home, separated from the church which he knew and loved and served, and essentially cast into the wilderness. In 1663, Watson published the short book that we now know as All Things for Good. It was originally called a Divine Cordial, a heavenly medicine. In it, Watson explains and applies Romans chapter 8 and verse 28, where the Apostle Paul says that we know that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. Some people use that language very casually, even crassly, perhaps clumsily, and it's been half quoted rather than really understood, as if we're simply to believe that nothing's really as bad as it seems and that every cloud has a silver lining. Well, as you would imagine from a Puritan, Watson does not make that mistake. What you have here is a pastorally sensitive and spiritually insightful unpacking of the whole verse. Watson wants to make sure that we do indeed know this. It's not a query, a question. It's an assertion. It's a declaration. We are confident, Paul was, Watson was, and we can and should be as well, that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And so Watson begins by driving home the reality of this and assuring us that real, lasting blessing is secured in accordance with God's providential government of all things and his particular regard to his beloved people. And so, as Watson unpacks this over the course of what in this edition are 9 short chapters, he begins by explaining that the best things work together for good to those who love God. That might be relatively easy for us to grasp, but Watson explains how the attributes of God, the promises of God, the mercies of God, the graces of the Spirit, the angels of God, the communion of saints, the intercession of Christ, and the prayers of the saints all work together for good. And that, in some ways, naturally makes sense to us. But Watson goes on to explain how the worst things also work together for good. And this is coming out of his own experience, both personally and pastorally. He tells us that 4 evils work together for good. The evil of affliction, trials and sufferings in this present world. The evil of temptation, when Satan dangles his bait before us. The evil of desertion, when we feel God distant from us. And even the evil of sin, when we transgress the law of the Lord. Now you listen to a catalogue like that and you think, how can that be? And that's where Watson moves on to explain why all things work for good to the godly. And it's rooted fundamentally in the wisdom, in the power, and in the goodness of God. The mighty mercy of the sovereign Lord, who works all things according to the counsel of his will, and who has set his love upon his people, is able to secure good even from the worst of things, even from evils. But Watson wants us to understand to whom this comfort applies. And so he doesn't just stop by telling us casually and carelessly that everything's okay because all things work together for good. No, he says that all things work together for good to those who love God. He wants us to make sure that we actually can enter in to this comfort and be sure of these blessings. And so he talks about the nature and the ground and the kinds and the properties and the degrees of love that we should have toward God in particular. And he exhorts us to ensure that we know that we do indeed love God and so can enjoy this assurance that all things are working together for good to us. In chapter 5 he gives us the tests of love to God. He helps us to ask and to answer the question whether or not this is true of us. Then in chapter 6, and here he becomes perhaps even more stereotypically Puritan, if you will. He exhorts us to love God and spells out 20 motives for such love. Now, you may hear that and say, oh, really? Is that, if not, we know it's not impossible, but is it necessary? Isn't that more exhausting than exhaustive? It's certainly well developed, but it's rich and it's sweet. It's Watson doing that wonderfully puritanical thing of, as it were, just turning a truth around in his hand and studying out the various facets of it, holding up God before our eyes and showing us in his being and his doing why he is so eminently worthy of our love. And so, having exhorted us to love God, to come to God with love, trusting him and adoring him, he also wants believers to preserve and to increase our love to God. He says, in effect, don't just rest where you are. The infinite loveliness of God ought to stir up and draw out ever increasing affection of him and adoration toward him. But then Watson digs deeper again, because once more the verse doesn't finish with the assertion that we know that all things work together to those who love God. Watson explains for us that those who love God can also be described as those who are called according to his purpose. And so he carries us down to the foundations. He takes us to the root of the matter in the sovereign saving purposes of the Almighty, who has called us to himself and has purposed that we should be conformed to the image of his Son. So nothing superficial here, carrying us further and further down and asking us to think about where we were when God found us and how God worked in us. And for those of us who preach, when Watson's talking about the means of effectual calling, the method that God uses to call sinners, the properties and the end or purpose of that calling, it's wonderful to see how Watson traces the gracious dealings of God with sinners in the world under his word, as his Spirit works upon them to draw them to himself with faith and love in hope. And he wants us then, if we are those who've been called, to admire God's free grace, to pity those who are not yet called, and to walk worthy of our high calling, to make a proper response to God for all his rich mercies toward us. And then his last and brief chapter concerning God's purpose, that it is the cause of salvation and it is the ground of assurance. You see, Watson's aim is not to shake us, but to settle us. Yes, some may need shaking, and Watson will do that, but he wants us to know where we stand. If we are not yet lovers of God, to be moved toward him, and if we are, to be rooted and grounded in him, to understand the glorious saving purposes of God in Christ Jesus. And so this becomes a fairly brief but wonderfully thorough and careful pastoral treatment of the providence of God. At all times, and especially in bad times, we need to know that all things work together for good to those who love God. We need to know it for ourselves, and we need to know it for others. And so this is a book for reading, for going through ourselves. It's a book for studying, tracing out not just what Watson teaches here, but how that is reflected and revealed in the lives that we and countless others have lived in the service of our God and King. It's a book for giving, for passing on to others who may need its particular comforts. And it's a book for knowing. Watson doesn't want it to remain a question in our minds as to whether or not this is so. He wants us to be sweetly assured of the truth. And so, if we need comfort, or if we need to offer comfort, this is and remains a heavenly medicine, a divine cordial. all things do work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose. And this book will plunge us into some of the depths of that. It will assure us of that. It will equip us to teach it and to know it for ourselves. And so I hope that you too will be confident that all things work together for good to those who love God, to those who are the called according to his purpose, and that this book, if you've not read it before, or if you need to read it again, will be a blessing to you in assuring you of that and equipping you to communicate it savingly and for enduring and lasting happiness to others.